The next topic we'd like to discuss in talking about managing hardware on Unix and Linux is installing printers. Now printers, as I've mentioned before, can actually be tricky to install, and you actually have to know several pieces of information, including the manufacturer and model and so forth in some cases. But you also need to know whether it's a USB printer, a parallel printer, or a serial printer. And Unix and Linux tend to support all three of those. Now normally USB printers, when they're installed, actually are fairly easy to install. Most modern USB printers are supported by Linux and Unix, and it really has a lot to do with the way that Linux and Unix supports USB, not necessarily the printer itself. Now if you're going to do it the old-fashioned way, printers can be installed and managed in Unix through the LPD, the line printer daemon. That's a command line utility. It's also a service that runs, and there's a lot of different configuration options for it. The etc printcap file is the configuration file for LPD on BSD Unix in any case, and that may vary amongst other Linux distributions and Unix flavors as well. So we'll take a look at LPD and etc printcap, and then we'll switch gears to OpenSUSE 11 and see how printers can be managed through the graphical interface. We're back in our FreeBSD 8 box, and let's just do a quick man on LPD. Now LPD, basically the line printer spooler daemon, manages most if not all printer functions on at least old Unix and modern Unix flavors, but also on Linux as well. Now it's configured and managed in different ways depending upon the Linux or Unix you're using. A lot of the most modern Linux distributions use a graphical utility to do it, but if you're a mind to, you can configure this using the command line, and there are some different options here. You need to know the port first of all, and that could be the parallel port, of course, or the serial port. You also may manage it using USB. Now there's different options you can put into the LPD configuration. If you go through the LPD man file, you'll see a lot of these, and again there's lots of different options here. You can even specify which hosts have access to the line printer daemon in etc host if you like. Those are just a few of the options. Again, it really is going to depend on what options you have with your printer and how you want to install this. Let's take a look at etc printcap, and that's the configuration file for LPD on FreeBSD. And if you look through here, you can see there are a lot of different options as well, and it gives you actually samples, ways you can configure the printer for remote or network printers. Let's do less on this instead so we can get the entire file. And it basically explains how you can set up this file for a raw printer and some of the different options that you can use. Again, we've got remote printer options, we've got typical line printer options, and you can see some of the verbiage that you'll have to use. You'll have to specify which device to use, which port, where you want the spooler file and output to go, and where you want the errors to go. So using the template they've provided here, it shouldn't be too difficult to configure a printer. Again, as long as you've configured the correct options and as long as the LPD service is running and configured properly. Probably an easier way for the beginner, and a more modern way actually if you're used to using newer Linux distributions, is to do this graphically. And again, we're going to look at OpenSUSE at YAST, and we're going to see how a graphical utility for configuring printers is set up. And it's actually not that difficult to do. We've got a hardware option here, and let's click on printer. And again, we're going to need to know different information about the printer itself. We're going to need to know things like what print queue we want to use, if it's a networked printer, whether to accept from anywhere or just from certain hosts or devices. We also will be able to configure how to share printers. For example, we can deny or allow remote access, and if we allow it, we can specify which computers within the local network can use it. We can set up policies for errors and so forth. We can resend jobs, we can abort and delete jobs if there's an error and so forth. There's also some auto-config settings, and USB printers can be configured through these auto-config settings, such as no automatic configuration or to specify UDEV configure printer for automatic configuration. Now, as you can see, there's a lot more wider range of options, at least it appears that way, in the graphical utility. But however, you actually have all these options when configuring LPD manually. It just requires a little bit more knowledge and maybe a little bit more tweaking in order to get printers to work correctly. Now that with the advent of most modern Linux distributions and some modern Unix distributions, you have the ability to set these up graphically and make it a little bit easier on yourself and actually have a wider range of options available to you. So we've looked at a couple of different ways to set up printers in Unix and Linux, using LPD, etc printcap, and YAST.